The woods were always a place of peace and tranquility for the town of Brinfield. They were a place where families went to have picnics, couples went for romantic walks, and kids went to play. But one family, the Ross family, never returned from their trip to the woods. What happened to them remains a mystery to this day. It was a typical Saturday morning in Brinfield. The sun was shining and the air was crisp. Families were getting ready to go to the woods for their weekend activities. Among them were the Ross family, John, his wife Karen, and their two children, Tommy and Sophie. They were looking forward to spending the day in the woods and having a picnic. As they drove into the woods, they noticed something strange. The woods were eerily quiet. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels running around, and no rustling of leaves. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. John parked the car and got out to set up the picnic table. As he was setting up, he noticed that the woods were darker than usual. The trees were closer together, and the sun struggled to penetrate through the leaves. He shrugged it off, thinking it was just his imagination, and went back to the car to get the food. The family sat down to eat, but they couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over them. Karen suggested they go for a walk to explore the woods and get some fresh air. John agreed, and they packed up their things and set off into the woods with their children. As they walked deeper into the woods, they noticed that the trees were getting thicker and the underbrush was becoming denser. It was becoming more difficult to walk, and the family was starting to get tired. They decided to turn back and head to the car. But when they turned around, they realized they were lost. They couldn't find their way back to the picnic table, and the woods had become even darker than before. They started to panic and called out for help, but there was no answer. The family walked aimlessly for hours, trying to find a way out of the woods, but they were lost. Night was starting to fall, and they knew they had to find shelter. They stumbled upon an old cabin in the woods and decided to take refuge there for the night. As they entered the cabin, they noticed that it was empty. There was no furniture, no bedding, no food, just an old fireplace and a few candles. They tried to make themselves comfortable, but the darkness and silence were overwhelming. As they settled down for the night, they heard strange noises coming from outside. It sounded like something was scratching at the door. John went to investigate, but there was nothing there. They brushed it off as the wind, but the noise continued throughout the night. The next morning, the family woke up to find that Sophie was missing. They searched the cabin and the surrounding area, but she was nowhere to be found. They called out for her, but there was no answer. They decided to search the woods for her. As they walked deeper into the woods, they noticed that the trees were even closer together, and the underbrush was thicker. They were struggling to move forward when they heard a faint crying sound. They followed the sound and found Sophie curled up under a bush. Sophie was in a state of shock. She was trembling, and her eyes were wide with fear. When they asked her what had happened, she told them that she had seen a man in the woods. He was wearing a black coat and a hat and had a terrifying smile on his face. He had grabbed her and whispered something in her ear before letting her go. The family was terrified. They knew they had to leave the woods and get help. They started to run, trying to find their way out of the woods. But the woods seemed to be endless, and they couldn't find their way out. The man in the black coat seemed to be following them, always just out of sight. As they ran, they stumbled upon an old graveyard in the middle of the woods. The tombstones were old and weathered, and the names were barely visible. But one name stood out, the name of the man who had owned the cabin they had stayed in the night before. Suddenly, the family realized that they had been walking in circles. They were trapped in the woods with no way out. They were running out of food and water, and their energy was dwindling. They knew they had to find a way out, or they would die in the woods. The man in the black coat continued to follow them, always just out of sight. They could hear his laughter and whispers in the darkness. They were terrified, and they knew they had to do something to protect themselves. As they were walking, they stumbled upon an old shack in the woods. It was dilapidated and barely standing, but it was their only hope. They decided to take shelter in the shack and try to figure out a way to escape the woods. As they were resting in the shack, they heard a loud banging on the door. The man in the black coat had found them. He was outside, trying to get in. They could hear his laughter and whispers through the cracks in the door. They knew they had to keep him out, or he would kill them all. John found an old axe in the corner of the shack and decided to use it to barricade the door. He wedged the axe into the doorframe and tried to keep it closed, but the man in the black coat was too strong. He broke down the door, and the family was defenseless. The man in the black coat walked into the shack, his terrifying smile still on his face. He approached the family, his hands outstretched. They knew they were going to die, but suddenly the man stopped. He looked around, confused, and then vanished into thin air. The family was left alone in the shack, trembling and confused. They eventually found their way out of the woods and back to civilization. They reported the strange events to the authorities, but no one ever found out what had happened to them in the woods. The man in the black coat was never found, and the Ross family never went back to the woods again.